576 if you want to mark that. And if you want to open up to Chronicles, then we'll be doing an overview in Chronicles tonight. I'm excited about this one because Chronicles is one of those books that definitely like the first 9 chapters is genealogy and boring. And I think you get so bogged down into the boring and it gets so cumbersome that it's just like, okay, 9 chapters of this, and then you get to the second part and you're just kind of lost. But I think that there's something in this book that I've learned in the overview that makes it really a neat book, a really neat book. And I think that you'll enjoy it. I've really enjoyed reading Chronicles with the stuff that I've learned about this. And so I'm happy to share that. I do have one thing before we get started with Chronicles tonight. Did you, by any chance, get a closing prayer? Jacob is on the closing prayer tonight, and he's not here tonight. So, Mark, how about you want to do closing prayer? All right. Okay. Just a couple things about Chronicles. Look at this. This is super interesting about the start. The Hebrew title for Chronicles, it's one book. We call it 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That didn't happen until the Septuagint. But in the Hebrew title of Chronicles, it is the events of the days, which that's kind of like Chronicles. I mean, that's basically what a chronicle is. I did a little Google search just to say, define chronicle, since that's not a word that I'm really going to use a whole lot. And a chronicle is a record in a factual and detailed way. That's a chronicle. A record in a detailed and factual way. And so the Hebrew title, the events of the days, is kind of like the events, a record of what's going on during these times. That's basically like a description of what a chronicle is. Jerome is the guy who in the late 300s, so like almost 400 years after the time of Jesus, Jerome is the guy who translated most of the Bible into Latin, which becomes the primary acceptable Catholic Bible for a really long time. That's the Vulgate. And Jerome called this book the Chronicle of the Whole Divine History. That's why we call it 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because that's what Jerome called it in Latin. It was the Chronicle. And so that's where the title in our Bibles comes from. The Septuagint, though, now this is where we start to get into something interesting. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, this is a copy and a paste from my Septuagint on my computer software. Good luck pronouncing that word. But here's what the word means. It means something kind of like things passed over, or things omitted, or things left out. And so the title of Chronicles in the Septuagint would immediately cause you to think, okay, we've got 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and then Chronicles, if you go with this title, Chronicles is like a supplement then of things that were left out of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and so there's extra stuff in Chronicles. I don't think that's a right way of looking at the book, but that's kind of what the title leads you to think, is that there is some stuff here in Chronicles that you're not going to get in other places. And this is just like a Jeopardy kind of, like a trivia kind of a thing. About half of Chronicles is from other places in the Old Testament. So half of Chronicles is going to be the stuff that you can only get in Chronicles, and you can't get anywhere else in the Old Testament. So that's the title. That kind of sets the stage for what we're getting ready to do. I'm just going to try to do one sweep through Chronicles. Instead of saying who wrote it, why did they write it, what's it about, and how's the book divided up, I think that we can kill all those birds with one big stone. If we go through like an overview, and boy, I'm really excited. there is some really interesting stuff here that I'm excited to show you. Even the genealogies, it's really excited. So what we're going to do to try and answer all these questions and understand what Chronicles is about and why it's useful for me is to say that Chronicles is divided into 4 main sections. And I think as we look through these 4 main sections, that all of our other questions are going to be answered. I think that's the way that that's going to happen. So look at 1 Chronicles chapter 1, and by the time we get to 1 Chronicles chapter 2, if you know what you're looking for, I think you got your answers. Even in a genealogy. How could you possibly say that you have your answers in a genealogy? But they're there if you know what you're looking for. So 1 Chronicles, this one is really interesting. In chapter 1 and verse 1, it starts with Adam. So that's just one neat thing about Chronicles. Chronicles goes all the way, covers history, Jewish history, all the way from Adam to 539, when the Jewish people are allowed to come back from Babylonian captivity. There's no book, in the Bible at least, that covers that span of history. So you've got Adam starting in verse 26, I guess we make it to Abraham. And then in verse 28, we've got the sons of Abraham. And so here's the Jewish nation. But then you come to chapter 2 and check this out. Of all the Jewish lineage, of all the Jewish history, chapter 2 takes us straight to David. And that's going to be the key to unlock Chronicles. Chronicles is going to be, that's what Dave said, it's going to be a book about the Davidic king. And that really should jump off the page, like of every person in the Old Testament that we could talk about, that we make it to 1 Chronicles chapter 2, and immediately we're going to say, and where does David come from? And then if you look at chapter 3, it's not just where does David come from and who is David's genealogy. It's in chapter 3, it's who comes from David. And so we want to know in the first 3 chapters, where does David come from and who comes from David? It's all about that Davidic king. And then in chapter 4, we're going to start with the different tribes of Israel. But in chapter 4, we're not going to go in the order of birth of the children of Israel. We're going to start with the tribe of Judah, which is where David came from. So chapters 2, 3, and 4, straight out of the gate, tell us that Chronicles is David, David, David. Where did he come from? Who came from him? What about his tribe? This is going to be a lot of stuff to say about David. And so look at, just jump to the end of this section. You'll see chapter 8 gives us a genealogy of Saul. It tells us where Saul came from and who came from Saul. But look at chapter 10. I guess really starts in 935. There's Saul's genealogy. But chapter 10, this is where the actual history starts. This is where the story starts in Chronicles. And just all you have to do is look at the heading above chapter 10. The only thing that we know about Saul when Saul was king is how he died. And the only reason why we know about Saul and that he died is because this is how David came to be king. And so you've got the lineage of David. You've got, and there was a king before David. His name was Saul, and here's how he died. And now in chapter 11, this is where we're going to start the story of David. And so part 1 is going to be 1 Chronicles 1 through 9. It's going to be the genealogies. But if you could, now listen, there's not very much you can do to make this interesting. There's just not. But it might be a little more interesting to read through the genealogies if you at least know why the genealogies are there in the first place. That might be more interesting to help understand that we're tracing the seed of David, this lineage of David. So that's part 1. Part 2 is going to be 1 Chronicles chapter 10 to verse 29. So 1 Chronicles 10 through 29 is going to correspond with 2 Samuel, which is all about David and David's story. But there's something going on here with David and David's story that probably ought to start saying, hey, here's our emphasis. Look at chapter 13. 1 Chronicles chapter 13. We've got a really big story here about David and the ark. David really wants the presence of God. And so he goes and he gets the ark and he's got the Uzzah situation, and that's really frustrating for him. But then in chapter 15, he's going to push through it and he's going to say, no, we need the presence of God in the ark in Jerusalem. And so chapter 15 is we're bringing the ark to Jerusalem. In chapter 16, we're still talking about the ark. And so bring the ark to Jerusalem. And then in chapter 16, you get this song, which is basically Psalm 105, the first half of Psalm 105 and Psalm 96, these two psalms. And so chapter 16 and verse 37, this is God, David worshiping God because the ark has come to Jerusalem. And chapter 17 is God's promise to David. That corresponds with 2 Samuel chapter 7. And so here's the thing. This is what I want you to see about Chronicles as we start to look at the stories that are told. It's not just a story about David and the battles that he fought. It's a story about David and God, and David's heart for God, and how David wants to be in the presence of God. And it's about bring the ark, and I'm going to build a house for God. And God makes this great promise with David. If 2 Samuel is a story, a history about David and things that David did, 1 Chronicles 10 to 29 is going to be a story about how David was a religious and God-loving and God-fearing man. That's going to be the main emphasis of Chronicles. And there's something that I think is really, this is where you start to say, okay, I think I see what's going on here in the Chronicle letter. Turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 20. And we're going to read a couple verses, like 3 verses here in 1 Chronicles 20. And this is going to be where you start paying attention. Remember how the Septuagint called Chronicles things left out or things omitted? I think that title's right, but for a different reason that you might be thinking. What I immediately think is Chronicles is a list of stuff that was left out of 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. Maybe more close is to ask yourself, what does Chronicles leave out? Not only what does it include, but what does it leave out? So 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 1, in the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army and ravaged the country of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem, and Joab struck down Rabbah and overthrew. Okay, we know where we are, right? We know the story. We know what's coming right now. That David stayed at home. He didn't go out to battle with all the other kings when the kings went out to battle. We know what's going on here in this story. Verse 2, and David took the crown of their king from his head and found that it weighed a talent of gold, and it was a precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. And he brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount. And he brought out the people who were in it and set them to labor with saws and iron picks and axes. And thus David did to all the cities of the Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. And just keep on looking at your headings and what comes next in the story. What is not included in the story of David? What did we leave out? Say it. Someone say it. Oh, whoops. Whoops. I forgot to tell that part of the story. The whole David and Bathsheba and Uriah. and everything that comes from that. Not in Chronicles. You're not going to find the Amnon and Tamar story that comes from that, and then that leads to Absalom and the whole battle about Absalom that comes and tries to take the kingdom away from David, and how David has to run from his son, and all kinds of bad stuff that happens. And it even goes even farther in 2 Samuel. Like the whole second part of 2 Samuel is not a good story. It's a really depressing story for David. And none of that is in 1 Chronicles, in the story of David. 1 Chronicles is going to be really, really interested in painting a good picture of David. And I'm not going to be critical of the chronicler. Like, I'm not trying to say that he was trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. We all know about those stories. But what we're trying to say is, what's he doing? What is the chronicler? What is this book trying to accomplish in saying, here's where David came from, and here's who David was, and he was a really religious king. In fact, you want to talk about being a religious king, turn over to chapter 22. David prepares for the temple building. And basically from 22 all the way to the end of 1 Chronicles, what David is doing is he's making preparations for building the house of God. And so Chronicles is not just a story about the history of David. Chronicles is a story about David and God. David and his relationship with God. And God is really showing that this is a man after God's own heart. And there's not a whole lot of bad that we're going to find about David in Chronicles. Part 3 is going to be 2 Chronicles 1 through 9, and that's Solomon. And, we know a lot of stuff about Solomon and Solomon's story from 1 Kings. That's where Solomon's story starts. But just do this. Just flip for 9 chapters and look at the headings in 2 Chronicles 1 through 9. We're introduced to Solomon in chapter 1. Solomon prays for wisdom. In chapter 2, we're going to get straight to the temple, and Solomon builds the temple in chapter 3, and he furnishes the temple in chapter 4, and the ark is brought into the temple in chapter 5, and Solomon's great prayer of dedication at the temple is in chapter 6. And then there's the dedication of the temple in chapter 7, and everybody appreciates Solomon and how great he is in chapters 8 and 9. And so I will ask you this, in 1 Chronicles, I got to get my verses. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, let's start in verse 13. We won't read all of this. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which the explorers and the merchants brought. And so we find out that Solomon was really rich. In verse 22, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, and all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. He had lots of horses in verse 25. Solomon had 4,000 stalls of horses and chariots, and 12,000 horsemen whom he stationed in the chariots and the cities of the king of Jerusalem. And he ruled over all the kings of the Euphrates from the land of so he has a really big kingdom. And then in verse 29, he dies. And so here's our question. What do we leave out? Yeah, and not only the wives, but everything that goes with the story of Solomon and his wives. In 1 Kings chapter 11, this is the part of the story where it says, now King Solomon loved many foreign women, and the heading above 1 Kings 11 is, Solomon turns from the Lord. That's kind of a big deal. And then in chapter 11, 1 Kings chapter 11, and verse 11, therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. And so look back at 2 Chronicles chapter 10. We're going to have the story of Rehoboam and how Rehoboam is the king that follows Solomon. But what we don't find out in 2 Chronicles is why Rehoboam and Jeroboam split. It's because Solomon left the Lord and God took the kingdom away from him. He only gave Solomon a couple tribes, and Israel got everything else. And so we know about David and where he came from. And we know that David was a man after God's own heart. And we're going to talk about all the good stuff with David and his relationship and his passion for God. And then we're going to talk about Solomon and how Solomon built the temple. And, you know, there's the part about all the wives and how he fell away. But we're not going to mention that in 2 Chronicles. And then the fourth part of Chronicles 10 through 36 is going to be Judah, the story of Judah during the divided kingdom. Are you calling it the divided kingdom in your class material? The divided kingdom, right? Where you have Israel in the north and you have Judah in the south. But Chronicles does not talk about Israel. You're not going to get the kings of Israel and the story of Israel. You're only going to get Judah and the story of the descendants of David. And so in chapter 10, in verse 1, you see Rehoboam. In chapter 13, there's Abijah. In chapter 14, there's Asa. And so we're only going to track the story of Judah in Chronicles. And here's going to be, just look at these stats. 2 Chronicles has 822 total verses. 528 of those verses, that's 64%, if I'm doing my math correctly. I tried to do the math and then I checked it, and then you know when I start doing math, things get really bad fast. So take the percentages with a grain of salt. But I think that 64% of 2 Chronicles deals with 5 good kings of Judah. Okay? 64% of the verses in 2 Chronicles deal with 5 good kings. The other 294 verses, 36%, deal with all the other 16 kings who were losers. Well, they weren't all losers, but most of them were. And so you think about 2 Chronicles, and we're going to think about painting a picture of the Davidic king and how the Davidic king loves God and leads the people of God to God. And just proportionally, when you look at how 2 Chronicles is divided up, you can see that the chronicler really wants to talk about Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah and Josiah. We really want to talk about those good kings. And the bad kings, we'll mention them and we'll say that they existed, but we're not going to really talk about them very much. And in fact, 2 Chronicles, look at 2 Chronicles chapter 33. In fact, how about you people up here on the front row? Who was the worst king of Judah? Manasseh. Manasseh was the guy who caused God to come to the end of his stick and to say, I'm taking the kingdom away from you. And that does happen in 2 Chronicles. But do you know what we have in 2 Chronicles that we don't have in 2 Kings with Manasseh? That he repented and that God forgave him. And so even when we're going to talk about the really, really bad kings, we're still going to say, but there was some good stuff. And there really is, legitimately. Like, this is how we're going to find out about Manasseh. So 33 and verse 10, the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army and the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks and bound him with chains of bronze and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, Manasseh, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. And then in verse 14, he's going to start to do a bunch of good stuff. In verse 16, he restored the altar of the Lord and offered on it a sacrifice of peace offerings. In verse 18, even the conclusion. Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh and his prayer to his God and the words of the seers who spoke to him in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. Behold, they're recorded in the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. And his prayer, let's remember his prayer, and how God was moved by his entreaty and all his sin and his faithlessness and the sights and all of that. And so we're going to really hype and talk about the good, and we're going to minimize the bad. But even when we talk about the bad, we're going to say, yeah, but even Manasseh prayed and repented. That's what you're going to get in Chronicles. And so here you go. I said we were going to try and knock out all of these birds with one stone. We're wrapping this up. We're almost done. But you should be able by this point, knowing what you know, you should be able to start to put together a picture of what 1st and 2nd Chronicles is and what 1st and 2nd Chronicles is trying to accomplish. And I think here is going to be the key to understanding. Look at the very end of 2nd Chronicles. And you're going to start reading in 2nd Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 22. And I'm going to do this just to make a point, but I'm going to tell you first what I'm going to do. I'm going to be reading from Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1. You read 2nd Chronicles 36, 22. I'm going to read Ezra 1, starting in verse 1. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up. Ezra keeps going. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. That's where Chronicles ends. Chronicles ends with Israel having been in Babylonian captivity for 70 years, and Cyrus, king of Persia, says to Israel, you're allowed to go back home now. And this is why I'm letting you go back home, so that you can build a house for me. And so that really causes us to think, what does Judah need right now in this situation? Now that they're going back home to build God's house. What do they need right now more than anything? They need a Davidic king who's going to lead them in building God's house. And they need a Davidic king like Hezekiah and Josiah, who's going to take this broken mess and just put everything back together in the way that it was supposed to be, according to the pattern that David established. And so if you read Chronicles through this lens, that God is saying to his people, go back to Jerusalem and start from scratch. What we need more than anything right now is a David and a Hezekiah and a Jehoshaphat and an Asa and a Josiah. Somebody who's going to say, we need to build God's house and to worship God according to the manner of David our father. That's what Chronicles is about, and I think that's why Chronicles is what it is. Now, we get some good leaders in Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to get Zerubbabel, who is the Davidic heir, who is going to lead God's people in rebuilding the temple. We're going to get that afterwards. Turn over to John chapter 2, though. More than anything else, what Chronicles is teaching us is that as a body of God's people, what we need more than anything else is a Davidic king who's going to lead our hearts to God and who's going to lead us in the way that we should go in building up God's house like David did. That's what we need. And you know good and well before I even read it that Jesus is that Davidic king who leads us in that way. In John chapter 2, in verses 13 through 22, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and money changers sitting there, making a whip of cords. He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins on the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." And his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Jesus is that Hezekiah and that Josiah who says, what we need right now is a house of God that is what it's supposed to be. In verse 18, so the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the Jews said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scriptures and the word that Jesus had spoken. Jesus is our Davidic king. With nothing but love and passion and concern for God and building up God's house and leading us in the way that we should go. Chronicles points us to him in that way. And so here's going to be my one-sentence summary of Chronicles. We need a Davidic king with a heart for God who will build God's house and lead us in the way that we should go. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, Chronicles is this book about exile and how we get to leave our captivity and go back to where God is so that we can serve God. And that's exactly what Christianity is. Christianity is the story of us and our exile in sin away from God. And Jesus says, "Hey, come follow me, the Davidic king, and you can be a part of God's house." If you believe that Jesus is that king and you're willing to repent of your sins and to confess him, that's our confession. Jesus is king. Jesus is this Davidic king. Die to yourself, be buried in the waters of baptism, and when you come out of the watery grave, walk in newness of life. If you need to respond to this invitation, come forward as together we stand and sing.